Well, I'm thrilled to welcome back Amy Lin to Western North Carolina. As Patricia said, she's a 2017 graduate of our MFA program for writers. I'm honored to have this chance to talk with her about her just published memoir, Hereafter. This book shines on so many levels, Amy, and they're all brilliantly interwoven. Just as an overview for people who haven't read the book yet, and some of the things I'm going to hope to try to touch on in the questions ahead, it's a portrait of Curtis Nishiyama and the love that you two shared. It is a moving and brilliant articulation and representation of the misunderstood and painful and solitary sojourn that is grief. It's also a medical memoir, given the dimension of your own life-threatening illnesses during this period. And also all of it's happening during the larger isolation and medical crisis of a global pandemic. See, Lizzie, she knew you needed her right now. She's been through all of this. I'm gonna come up and say hello. And it's crucially the story of your growth as a writer, your emergence into that identity, and the role that calling played in you being in this here and this afternoon, right? So we both belong to MFA Program for Writers family, so it's going to be a surprise to no one. My focus, at least initially tonight, is going to be on craft and on your composition processes, because I was constantly thinking about that as I was reading the book. I want to focus first on structure and management of time, because I think those are brilliant achievements in this book. And to get toward that, I want to start with the epigraph to the book, which is from the artist Louise Bourgeois. And it reads, "You pile up associations the way you pile up bricks. Memory itself is a form of architecture." And so that epigraph, it marries your writerly art with Curtis's, who was an architect. But it's also, I think, a signpost to your method. So this book is in 184 sections, most of them complete on a single page. And we understand them as the bricks, in a way, the associative bricks that are building this living memory of the book. I found them, as a poet reading this book, quite prose poem-like in their concision and their compression, their heightened sensory detail, their imagery. And I know that your book had its genesis in the newsletters that you were posting after Curtis's death. So I'm wondering, was this short sectioned approach there from the beginning? Maybe you can talk a little bit about how the form evolved from the original newsletters.
Yeah, thank you. Those are such beautiful words. I'm so grateful for that. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. It's so special to be back in Asheville, which in so many places was a place that I stepped into really at the beginning of my relationship with Curtis. And Deb called me and offered me a place here, maybe only 5 or 6 months into my relationship with Curtis. So in so many ways our journeys have been twinned. And I remember when Deb called me, just as an aside, saying, "Do you know that you called a Canadian Amy?" I was like unsure if you could. I was like, maybe you mean someone else. And so it's so special to be back here. The book, as you said, came out of the Substack that I started writing after Curtis died, called At the Bottom of Everything, which I still write in. And it's very long form. The letters, which are still archived online, and the letters that I still write now are long form, and they happen in the time that they happen. But it really wasn't until about a year into writing the Substack that I began to consider a book. And I really only started to consider it because my agent called me at about a year and said, "Well, do you think this project is maybe actually moving towards a book?" And I truthfully just always want to be my agent's favorite. So I said yes. But it was a lie. I hadn't thought about it as a book. And after I hung up the phone, I thought, okay, well, I better actually see what I've done. And so I put all of the letters into a Word document, and I had about 110,000 words. And I thought, oh, that's a book length. But as I continued to work in the Word document, I realized that there is this boundary line between a project which happens organically often a lot of the time, and also happens in time, and a book, which is made. And the very nature of creating a book or of creating memory or any of that is that it happens outside of time, and it happens outside of temporality in the way that we experience it in the day-to-day. And I realized that while I had a project, and a project that really had its own lifeblood, I didn't have a book. And I began to think that maybe I was going to be made a liar in front of my agent, which is a terrible thing when you're trying to be the favorite. And I worked for months in this document, and nothing was revealing itself to me as a made piece of art until I started to take things away. And I actually, as an experiment, I created these text boxes in Word, which are these very small boxes that you can make on a Word page, and they're boundaries. And you can only fit as much text in the box as it is big. And they're very small, or in my case, they were very small. And I would take a page by page in this extraordinarily long Word document, and I would put every single word that was on the page into the box. And I would go line by line, and I would delete everything that felt that it did not exactly represent the sort of bright bone of grief for myself and for my experience. And I did this for months. It's a very long process. And I think generation has its own kind of terror when you're working on the page, but there is something particularly awful and brutal about elimination on the page. And it was once I started doing that, and these very concise, very dense pieces of writing started to emerge, that I realized, okay, this is the project. This is the book that has announced itself. And those would become these chapters that are in the book itself.
The value of constraint. Our students hear a lot about that. What comes out of confining yourself.
Yeah, you know, it's such a concept that's so key in so many ways to teaching as well, which is that constraints often enable us to go beyond them, but we are rarely able to go beyond anything when we have all possibility before us. It's usually typically only if you give somebody or something a boundary that instinctively people will look to go beyond the boundary or look to see what's beyond it.
Well, I want to move from the bricks, which I think is really not the right word for something as shimmering as what you create on each page, but Louise has told us to use that word, so we're going to use that here.
Good enough for Louise.
To the assemblage of memories architecture in this book, and so there's also, you know, the slippery issue of memory itself, and so I'm going to read 4 lines from your pages. These come from 4 different sections at the very beginning and not too far from the end. They cover the whole scope. So I do not always know how to remember. When he dies, I fall out of time. I cannot stop remembering. It is a shadow I can't get beyond. I worry I am not remembering him correctly. So this is a retrospective volume. It's presented entirely in present tense. There's a steady underlying chronological progression that covers about 2.5 years, but with the frequent and wonderfully rhythmic insertion of flashbacks, especially in the first half. It's such an achievement of the book, it seems to me, how oriented we always are in these convergences of present reportage and this concurrent, ever-present past that informs the reading as well. So I'm just interested in hearing about any or all of those aspects of assemblage, you know, the sequencing of the sections, the slipperiness of memory that's there everywhere, the rhythms and proportions of flashbacks, because we linger with certain incidents far longer than others. And that's part of what creates that rhythm, I think, as you feel as a reader. And also the decision to keep the entire book in present tense, which I found fascinating.
Yes, thank you. What a gorgeous question. So the present tense, which was a conversation certainly with my agent before we sent the book out, but was definitely a conversation with my editor, was a point upon which I was quite insistent, and something that my editor and agent both really supported, because I really needed the book to represent the experience of grief for myself. And for myself, all of grief is present tense. When Curtis died, everything that had come before me, which was to say I met somebody, we dated, we got married, we had plans to move, all of the narrative of my life ceased to exist when Curtis died, or certainly ceased to make any sense. And that's one of the problems of grief, which is that it's a problem of narrative, because you become somebody whose life does not follow chronology. I am a person who got married. I am a wife who had a husband, but I am neither a wife nor married anymore. And when Curtis died, what had come before this wifedom, this marriage, this being in love, that was more present to me than what was real, which was to say, I could not comprehend the ways in which I was in a world where Curtis did not exist, or where my wife did not exist. And we know that grief is not just an emotional trauma, it's a physical trauma. And so part of that feeling that your life in the before is more real to you than your life now is actually a problem of physiology, which is to say that the brain neurologically has not actually processed that there is no use for the neural pathways they have for the people that you love. And when the brain meets someone, it encodes two things. The first one is it encodes a pathway for the you, so that you don't confuse yourself with them. But it also, particularly if you enter a protracted relationship with somebody, it encodes a third thing, which is the we, which is the you with them. And to the brain in a relationship, there are not two people in a relationship, there are three. There is the you, there is the me, and there is the we. And when someone dies, the brain has to begin this very traumatic experience of dismantling the pathways to the you, but also the pathways to the we. And a kind of self-death begins that can make a lot of grievers, and I've heard this from many people I've spoken to, feel insane. They feel like they're dying, and they feel like what they knew then is the realest thing, and at the present is the unreal thing. And lots of grievers, and this was shared by myself, have shared with me that they will walk through familiar spaces, or I would walk through my parents' home where I grew up after Curtis died, and I would touch things and I would think, well, this is a table. But that felt so unreal to me. And that's emotional work that grief prompts, but it's also physically labor. And all of that felt to me essentially communicated in the present tense. The grief has its own grammar, that it forces you to learn an entirely different way, a language of being. And it felt essential to me that there be no demarcation between what had come and what was, because in grief, there is none. And so it felt so obvious to me that it would be present tense, until of course my editor said, but how are people supposed to know in time where they are? And I said, well, I'm not in time. Grief has shattered that for me. And in addition, of course, to having this present tense choice, the book moves, as you said, so beautifully through so many times, through the 7 years of Curtis and my life, through the 2 years of acute grief, which is actually 5 years long, but not fully represented in the book. And I was weaving things back and forth because I think that's what the grieving do. They seasick between what they are remembering and what they are experiencing. And there's a third thing, a third reason for why I was constantly weaving the beats of the story together, was part of my experience of loss has been constantly searching for Curtis everywhere. It's an old habit from loving him for so long that I would always look for him. And I still do it. There's been a couple of times on this tour where just for a second I've walked somewhere and I thought, oh, I wonder if Curtis has gotten asleep. It's just such a microsecond. It's so natural to who we are that when we love somebody, we look for them. And I wanted, in the weaving of the beats of the story, I wanted the reader to constantly be looking for Curtis, to think that they might turn the corner of the page and that he might be there. because that mirrors something so essential to how I grieve, but also to, I think, how most of us grieve. And so I started this weaving, which in practical doing is kind of difficult, not just to think about the meaning that occurs through proximity. And that is something I thought a lot about, which is that if you place something very close to another thing, they will inevitably talk to each other. And when you're doing that kind of proximal work, I had to think a lot about what I was placing next to each other and what they were saying, because they were simply close to each other. But also it was physical work where I would print out these pieces and hunch over them for hours at a time, thinking about these meanings, and I would move and I would shuffle and I would move and I would shuffle. And I couldn't find a digital program that would do this for me, though I did genuinely try to find it. So it ended up being reams of paper and moving the furniture in the house so that I could lay out all of these pieces of paper, and for days, weeks, months, shift and consider, and often read it out loud so I could hear what they were saying to each other, and repeating the process, which I think also in a strange way is so much what grief is forcing you to do. It's giving you your life in pieces. It's forcing you to relive it, and you're forcing yourself to think, okay, wife, but widow, and you're trying to create a conversation between the two. And I wanted the format of the book to live deeply in that.
It's so much a poet's process, what you're describing, you know, and I was very alert to it, that notion of proximity, honestly, reading to thinking, oh, how smart, really, you know, how effective to put these clusters of things together. And it is very effective. And I'm not at all, so it's actually really gratifying to think of you spreading everything out on the floor, because that's the way we do this, you know. There's something about the tactility of it, even though, yes, it would be much nicer to have a digital program, but I still, you know, I went through that with my students a lot too, just talking about how are we going to figure out the order of this thesis, you know, and that's part of, you know, reading it as a continuum. You generate all of these new things between it, and that's the magic of this book as well. I had a feeling when I was writing out these questions, I thought at some point Curtis needs to be center stage, and it's right here. You called him for it. You write in this book that he was always turned toward delight, and that is palpable in reading the book. The person that emerges from these pages is radiant and generous and vivid, you know, so full of the joie de vivre, and he infuses the narrative with so much buoyancy and humor too, which is very welcome in the book. And all of that's part of, you know, creating this person for us on the page. I kept thinking as I was reading it that, you know, that openness and positive energy must have infused the writing process for you too, as you were, I mean, for the grief and loss, he's there beside you writing this book. And so I'm wondering, and it may be an impossible question, if there are certain Curtis stories in the book that you felt particularly served as anchors or beacons for you, maybe during rough patches of putting it together, or just some that helped show you the way forward while you were writing it.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, the pieces about Curtis, in so many ways, writing them was like staring into the sun, which is that you sort of have to do it, or I certainly as a child felt compelled to do it. And also so incredibly nourishing and so amazing. Parts of the stories that felt essential to me, that always felt as if they would form the parts of who he was definitely the story that's in the book of him at the bar at the wedding. Because Curtis in a lot of ways was so soft, but he was not always that cheeky, except largely in private. And we had a lot of sort of long running practical jokes between the two of us that, well, truthfully, I played them on Curtis and he was delighted by them, you know, And then his only one was trying constantly to scare me and sort of leaping out of different places. But he was cheeky in his private life, and it felt very important to me because that was such a rare moment in public where I really saw it in such a clearly encapsulated way that it'd be there. And then also the scenes where Curtis is so capable of a capaciousness for joy. And there are several of those in the book. But that, I think, was one of Curtis's real giftings, was his pathway, his heartline to joy was so unencumbered by anything. And that was something that he showed me the way to so often. And that truthfully I relied upon him for, was he was in so many ways my pathway to joy. And I perhaps over-relied on him in that way, because I just always assumed that he would be there to do it for me. And it was only after Curtis died that I realized that when we love somebody, if we're sort of lucky enough to enter a relationship where we say that we love them, part of our work, I think, is learning to accept the person that they think that we are in love, or the person that they think that we can be. And Curtis really believed that I was a joyful, easily joyful person, which is really not true. I'm really just the human version of the skull emoji. That's me, you know? But he really believed that I had this capacity for joy. And I resisted it so much because it didn't feel that it was me. And after he died, I really realized the ways in which we limit the people that we love when we don't accept who they're reflecting back to us in love. And the ways in which we limit our own selves and our own capacity to love ourselves when we don't take the leap of accepting who they say we are in love. And I think part of the journey of this book, part of the writing of having, as you say, Curtis so close to the book and so present in the book, was stepping to the page each day in an acceptance of the person that he saw. And that's a really beautiful thing. It's a brutal thing. It's really brutal to accept what someone is offering you about yourself. And I felt truly capable of it only because of the kind of courage with which Curtis lived. And I like to think that the pieces about Curtis in the book are infused with that kind of life, which is a life far beyond my landscape, and really lives where Curtis lived. And I felt really honored to do the best that I could to carry that part of him that I knew to the page.
What I would like for you to do is read right now, if
Yes,
you would, all
of
right?
course.
Because we talked about you reading some sections, and I would love people to just hear your prose. And
Oh, it would
I
be
certainly
honored.
would love to hear it in your voice. So choose.
Thank you. So what I've been doing on tour is I've been asking my moderators for pages that they wanted to hear me read, and then I form reading selections around them. So some of the pages today have come at Deb's beautiful request, which I am so excited to honor. We're going to start at section 123. Does it feel like you've been run over by a train? This, from the on-call psychiatrist at the urgent psych intake center in the hospital. No, I say. You hear a train coming. The psychiatrist is very tall. His body is so much greater in span than the small office chair he sits on. He looks directly at me. He does not follow a set list of questions, and instead asks me about myself. And after I finish speaking, he responds in kind. Because of this thoughtful attention, I tell the psychiatrist about the Curtis dying, my almost dying, my wanting to die. I tell him about the stent that now resides within my body. I tell him I agreed to the procedure because the vascular surgeon informed me without the stent, the chance of another life-threatening clot event is high. I tell him what I have told no one else, because I do not want to wear out my loved ones with the truth. The stent is not about trying to live. It is about trying to decide for myself where the end will be. The grief is so intense, I say. I feel powerless all the time. I talked to the psychiatrist for a long while. Unlike others, he does not try to instruct me on what I should or should not do, what I should or should not feel. Instead, he tells me, "You are clearly the kind of person who will decide for herself." The muscles in my shoulder relax when he says this. This is exactly what I want. A sense of agency in a life I feel grief has totally overtaken. Before I leave his office, the psychiatrist asks if he can give me some advice. When I nod, he hands me a small charm shaped like a turtle. "Go slowly," he says. In my palm, the silver metal warms. After weeks of keeping my leg as still as possible, I am allowed to start moving around. A small ball of purple scar tissue forms in the skin of my upper thigh. This is where the catheter bearing a stent entered my body. Despite these signs of physical healing, the worsening of my grief continues relentlessly into month 8 and then month 9. I tell my parents, my best friends, that I do not intend to live past 35. I tell RJ, my therapist, too. I name the plan Freedom 35. I tell my loved ones about the plan because I want them to know that I am serious. I need them to know there is a limit to my capacity for pain. RJ asks if my intentions are absolute. I shake my head on my side of the computer screen. My plan is not fixed. I just do not want to endure this much pain for an indeterminate amount of time. The pain has to lessen, I tell RJ. One way or another, I need a path toward less. On Thursday, I try to roll a ball of dough into a pizza base, but I cannot get it. The flour lumps the dough a stringy mess. It's my fault. I used to lean against the kitchen wall and watch him flour the counter, knead the dough, roll it with a pin until it was perfect thin crust. When he offered to teach me, I shook my head. "I don't need to learn," I said. "I have you." He always told me, 50 years, Baker, 50 years. That is how long he felt we would be together. At least, he would add. He said it so much at some point, I started believing him. I dream of Curtis only once. In it, his hair is long, the way it was when I first met him. I see him ahead of me, leaning against a doorway. He turns as I approach him, and when he sees me, I ask if it is really him. "It really is," he says. We both know he has come back from the dead. I hold him. "How did you do it? How are you here?" He tells me what he had to do was difficult. "When you go," he looks at me. "Just go." I wonder what he means, what it cost him to come see me. But we are in some kind of open air vehicle. We are sitting beside each other, his shoulder against mine. I am telling him my heavy, my unspeakably painful, the way I used to, the way I need to. He shakes his head as I tell him. It is a small shake, his mouth pressed together softly, the edges of his lips turned up slightly. I've seen it before. I know what it means. It is as much a part of our internal language as anything. He says something after he shakes his head, but the words are lost to me as soon as he says them. That does not matter. The headshake tells me everything I need to know. It gives me what I have been looking for. I tell him it is so good to hear his voice again. I miss hearing you speak. He has such a unique cadence to his speech, a light and bouncy way of pronouncing words. But it's talking to you, I add, sharing things with you that I miss the most. The vehicle bearing us continues at the same pace, but the edges of the dream are thinning. We both know he is going to die again. We sigh deeply over the separation coming for us. Neither of us says anything more. There is not enough time. We shared a language that was all our own, but I am now the last speaker of it. At the end of May, it is my birthday. Katie and Braden ask what I would like to do. Nothing, I think, but we go out for a picnic. When I show up at the park, Moma, my puppy, sniffs the air jubilantly. I carry her in my arms and worry it is too hot outside for her small body. Sun is heavy on my arms and legs. Braden and Katie have brought sparkling wine, vegan cheese, specialty crackers, fancy meats. There are gourmet donuts too. A look at the gleaming spread. I know Braden and Katie love me. I can see it in front of me, but I cannot feel it. I cannot get to their love, or maybe it cannot get to me. I keep looking at the sky, which is a cloudless blue bowl, and thinking if I crack open my chest, that is what I will see too, empty blue. The year I turned 30, he gets into a minor fender bender because he fills the car so full of balloons he cannot see out of his mirrors. During the lockdown prompted by the pandemic, Curtis and I walk outside each afternoon. Once we pass a fluffy dog excitedly humping its owner's leg. We draw a wide berth, but both of us see the pink flesh of the dog's penis. We do a double take, and then we look at each other. I grin because he is already in his glee. The dog turns to look at us because Curtis is chortling so loudly. What a filthy, wicked smile he has. What a gleam in his eye. Thank you.
They have that interlude.
Thank you.
Yeah. You write, how can grief be so universal and yet so widely misunderstood? And when will others allow the mourning to live without expecting them to be cured? These are distilling questions, it seems to me, coming from the interior and exterior of grief in this book. And they propel the entire narrative. They're underneath. One of the subtle but especially effective ways that the book underscores these questions is in the juxtaposition of how pain is addressed in your experiences as a medical patient. Just got to hear a little bit about that with deep vein thrombosis and pulmonary embolism and the stent insertion, where pain can be diagnosed and seen, you know, an MRI and the CT scans and treated. But for this immeasurable, unbearable pain of grief, which is every human being's experience at some point, we've got no adequate language. We have ineffectual or misleading ways to address it, you know, even among the professionals. You did the good psychiatrist there, but we also have one who sees your writing as a hobby, and, you know, less effective grief counselors and so forth. The common misunderstandings about grief and misapplications, for example, of the 5 stages of grief that you address in this book, those are all one of the central aims among many others that we've already talked about. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the discoveries that you made about what you said, quote, the differences between the realities of grief and what is generally understood about it.
Yes, part of being so quickly plunged into grief, because Curtis died so quickly, and then we were in the middle of a global pandemic, and then my own health failed, was realizing that in both practical and intangible ways, physical grief has a kind of understanding that emotional pain does not. And part of that is, as you said, because we can measure physical pain. We can see a broken bone on an X-ray, but emotional pain is very difficult to pin down, and made even more difficult by the fact that there is so little language for it, and made even more difficult by the fact that the 5 stages of grief, which many of us are so familiar with, were never intended for the bereaved. They came out of a non-evidence-based study for people who have been diagnosed with terminal illness. And the lead researcher on that study speaks quite publicly about the fact that she regrets that this very specific data that she gathered on these people who were dying has been universalized to all kinds of grief, and that it does harm to people who are grieving, because we know that grief is chronic and that it is not linear, and that it is not passing through some sort of predictable stages. And I encountered all of this as I was grieving, not only the lack of knowledge about it, but also the ways in which we often consider physical pain to be the king. I was on a medical leave from my job teaching when Curtis died. And so I was given an insurance adjuster who evaluates your case and who considers how long you qualify for a medical leave. And she said several times throughout my case, and she would use air quotes when she said it, she was a very kind woman, but she would say, "You're so lucky that you're health failed." Because she said, on the strength of your husband dying, you wouldn't qualify for a medical leave for very long, maybe 2 months. But she said, because you have so many surgeons that have written in saying you physically can't move, which I couldn't. I had a walker, and I was very unable for so long. She said that, I believe she used the term bulletproof. She said, 3 surgeons, you will have as much support as you need. And she was so grateful, because she said, we know that emotional pain takes longer than 2 months, it takes a lifetime. But she was really grateful in some ways that I had so much physical pain that could be traced, because it allowed her to get me so much more support for the emotional pain. And that is such a burden for people who are grieving, that there is so little support for them, and not just systemically, but personally. People have such a human instinct to want to help you not be in pain. And that's something that's really beautiful generally about the project of humanity, which is that most of us, we don't want to see anything typically suffer, especially if it's right in front of us. And what we do have a lot of language for, what people reach for very easily because they're so comfortable with it, is the language of, I can help you feel better. And they offer that in so many different ways, but it is so isolating to people who are grieving, because it offers no place for people who are in pain to be as they are. If you have a physical broken bone and you have a cast, the world literally has to make space for the cast. They have to literally name it, lots of people sign it. But when you have emotional pain, the world wants to minimize it. They don't want to remind you that you're in pain, or this is what they say, or they want to make you feel better. But well meant, this is so misguided, because it doesn't allow for emotional pain to have space or to be witnessed. And I think that witness is I think it might be one of the only things we can really offer another person, especially if we love them, a space for them to be as they are. And I remember probably about 2 years after Curtis died, I was at a writing residency, and another artist asked me how long it had been since he died. And I said, oh, it's been about 2 years. And she said to me, that's so soon. And no one has ever said that to me before. Usually you kind of hit a year and people are like, oh, so you must be doing well now. And I just immediately cried. And I said, it is so soon. Thank you. And we know that acute grief is the first 5 years. That's just acute grief. Then you enter the chronic grief. But she gave me a space. She opened up a space between us where I was able to be as I was. And I was so moved by what she gave me. And I really try to offer it to other people when I speak to them. because it is soon. Grief is always soon for any of us. I received an email from a friend of my family's just last week when the book came out. And she said, my husband has been dead 13 years. And she said, it's so soon. And I thought, wow, yeah, it's so soon. And I think that part of why I wrote those questions into the book, and part of why so much of my experience of grief, but also of my experience of the misunderstanding of grief, was because I struggle to reconcile how so many of us are in so much pain. And yet we really just are not talking about it. And it's a chasm into which I fell that I genuinely am so moved by in so many ways, that we could carry such silence in so many ways and so much pain. And I have this idea that art must continue to ask questions until it asks the unanswerable question. And when you have pushed the questions far back enough, then you have arrived at the project's final form. And, you know, when I'm teaching, especially when I'm teaching undergrads, I'm sort of a little bit notorious for constantly saying, but have you asked the final question? Have you pushed them far enough? And so those questions are in the book because those are the questions that I arrived at genuinely in my experience of grief, in my experience of considering it, where they were not the questions I have answers to. I only have experiences for them. And it was important to me to write towards that as a way of opening up witness for myself, but also for other people, to allow them to be as they are.
Well, your book achieves that. I mean, it also told you about my own recent losses too, and your book was giving me some new angles and ways of not only thinking about it, but also engaging with what I hadn't faced.
Yeah.
Right. I was thinking back to, I know I'm watching the clock too, dear Patricia. Thinking back to the review that Robert Pinsky did of Joan Didion's Year of Magical Thinking, saying, you know, there are two kinds of magical thinking. One is beloved's coming back, and I've got to keep his shoes by the door.
Yes.
The other is I'm going to say this and it's going to help you.
Yes.
Yes. So, and her book engages with that as well. So, can I ask one really quick question before we go to our Q&As?
We'll have a few minutes.
Yeah, all right. This is the question I told you I was going to ask. So I want to honor us being here in Asheville and with a graduate of our program. And I was asking Amy how the voices of her 5 faculty mentors might have entered the process of creating this book. So if you wanted to talk about that a little bit, that'll be our way to move toward everybody else's questions.
That's such a good question. I'm so glad you've asked it. You know, the Warren Wilson program is so special because you know your advisors so well and you spend this very intense time corresponding with them. And what's so beautiful about that is that you have the letters and that it's not lost to your memory, and that I have all of those letters in my computer and they're all saved. And I will go back to them. And I often do, because often, especially for me, who came into the program, sort of green, no, not sort of, green, entirely green to writing. I had to Google what narrative perspective was. My first class, I had Toni Nelson was doing a beautiful conversation. And she was speaking about narrative perspective and distance. And I'm on my phone under the desk, like, what is narrative perspective? I really didn't know. I just did it. And so I came in very green. And so there were lots of things in the letters that I go back and read about craft that I was too bewildered by at the time, that now carry me really deeply because I have ventured a little bit further and feel more able to take the lessons on. And in the process of this book, I read a couple of letters. I returned to some of Liam's letters, which really spoke to me about the possibility of being a writer. And he spoke in a really beautiful craft way about it, about the ways in which time can be broken in the writing process and how the work lives outside of it. And a lot of that comes from Liam's teachings. And I looked at a lot of Lauren's letters, which spoke about that the best writing, that the writing that would insist would come from a place of intensity, and that the best way to edit towards that was to follow that. And a lot of that elimination work came from that, of trying to see for myself where the intensity lied. And that came directly out of things that Lauren had written to me in our time together. And, you know, there's so much more that I could do. I also really reviewed letters from Laura and from Robin, and of course from Karen Brennan, who, Karen in particular, is so good at just practical nuts and bolts work at the line level. And I really went back and I held those really carefully, especially because we have so few lines on a page. I wanted them to be as clear as possible. And Karen is so good at that. And Robin is so good at that as well. And I not only looked at Robin's letters, but I looked at her own memoir, which is so crystalline and so beautiful. And in terms of time, I don't know if there's a writer working or teaching about the possibilities and flexibility of time as there is Laura Vandenberg. What she does on the page is so thoughtful and so carefully considerate of time. And I read a lot because we spoke a lot about time in my time with her. And in so many ways, and I said this I wrote a letter after the book sold to all of my advisors, and I said to them, your fingerprints are all through this book. You can trace the lineage of your teachings to this work. And I remain so indebted to their outpouring of knowledge and wisdom, and so indebted to their support of me in not just on the page, but professionally. So many of them have carried me professionally in ways that are far beyond the landscape of generosity. It's really incredible what they have done for me, and I'm so grateful for it. And, you know, I feel so strongly, I've said this before, but I really do, grief is love's final form. All of us, if we love somebody, will grieve them, and we will have to do that. And I think in so many ways, through all of the letters that I would read as I was editing this book, while it wasn't in so many words, every person that I worked with said some form of that in some way, when pain, when grief would arrive, that would be love's work, and that a part of a writer's work would be loving them with what you had, which was writing. And I think that was something that's so core to the book. And it was so core to my work with my advisors. And it's what an ineffable gift they give us.
I think that's a wonderful note for us to conclude this part on, and we can have our Q&A.
Great, let's start off by a question from the live audience then. Don't be shy. She had some time to.
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Thank you for being
you're
here.
going to repeat.
I'm going to repeat
So
the
somebody's gonna
gist
repeat the
after you say
questions
your question so that they can hear it
virtual audience
online.
can hear it, so it could be paraphrased.
Okay. Everything you said is so beautiful, and I'm really looking forward to reading the book.
Thank you.
The cover is gorgeous.
Thank
I
you.
think it's one of the most beautiful covers I've ever seen.
Oh.
So I was just wondering if you could talk about that for a minute.
Yes. So the cover is done by a really beautiful designer named Anna Morrison, who does a lot of very different covers. And it was really a dream to work with her. She and I actually have a conversation in Lit Hub where we talk about the cover. If you really want sort of granular details, where we're talking about like why the color.
Yeah.
But sort of in broad strokes, it was very important to me, and Anna was so receptive to this, that the cover reflect the intensity of grief and the ways in which there is such a jarring dichotomy, which is why the color of the red is so high contrast with the blue, because, you know, there are the blues of sadness and I wanted that represented, but the instinct to go dark with the blue, to go indigo, to me completely eradicates the searing intensity of pain. And I wanted that to be present, which is why the cover is as intense in color and in res as it is. And there's almost a sort of suggestion of orange. It teeters between orange and red in a way that I felt was important, because I also didn't want the cover to evoke blood, you know. in a memoir about death. So it's why there's more of the sense of fire without it being orange, quite frankly. And I also wanted there to be a gesture towards longing and the ways in which grief asks us to reach for things for which we are not going to grasp, which is where these divers, which someone who works at my amazing agency, she said that the divers remind her of the cave of swimmers, which is so beautiful. And I truthfully, as soon as she said it, I thought, Anna and I didn't talk about this, but I bet Anna knew that when she drew them. As she's an illustrator, she illustrated the divers by hand. And that we have them moving through these circles, these literal different dimensions, I hoped would evoke the different dimensions of time through which the book moves. Thank you. That's a wonderful question.
You were going to talk for a moment or two about the cards.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that. Maybe hold one up for us
Okay.
and tell us a little bit about those.
Perfect.
Please, Amy.
So it's so wonderful. The bookstore has these cards. They're grief cards. And when the book was getting ready to publish, one thing that my incredible publisher does is they look for partnership opportunities for writers to connect with artists and with businesses. And even though I begged Aritzia to do a custom sweatsuit for me, because I wrote the book in a sweatsuit, and I really did, I emailed them and I said, would you love to do a sweatsuit line for me? And they were like, sorry, who are you? So that was a partnership that sadly I am still trying for. But I also reached out to Rainey, who is a beautiful visual artist who works and creates in upstate New York. And she's opening a store called the Little Art Shop very soon. And I asked her if she would be willing to do a line of grief cards with me, because there are so many bad grief cards in the world. And just so many cards that I received out of really good intentions that didn't quite say what people would mean. And a lot of them, they would buy the grief cards and they would cross out some of the messaging and write in what they meant, which is amazing. But also I just thought, what if I could work with Rainey, whose art is so honest and so heart forward, to offer grievers and readers cards that said some things that are honest about grief. And so she created this beautiful line of cards that she made out of the book. She read the book and she spent time in it. And, you know, they say things like, there is no right way to grieve, which I think every griever is dying to be told. I was so worried that I was doing grief in the wrong way. And it was really only my grief therapist that kept saying, well, there isn't a right way. And I was like, but I think that there might be. And so I'm so grateful that there's a card now that we can give to people, or this card which says love is longing forever, which is something really beautiful that Rainey herself brought out of the book. Or there's another that I love that says grief is a vortex, and just acknowledging the realities of grief for people. I think that's the best thing that we can do, is to look at someone who is grieving and tell them and step into what's true for them, that it is really hard, that it isn't going away, and offering them a space to share that with you. And I was so lucky and I'm so honored that Rainey made these in collaboration with me. And I hope you will see them because they are beautiful and they're available online too if you're not in store.
Question from the audience, please.
Thank you for speaking so beautifully.
Oh, thank you for being
I'm so
here.
excited to read this book. I know you first as a beautiful fiction writer, and I'm curious whether you could talk about how that played into nonfiction memoir writing, and are they, where did it cross pollinate or not?
Oh, I love that. Do you want to repeat?
So the gist of the question is the cross-pollination of Amy's work as a fiction writer and now her work as a nonfiction writer.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I love this question. One thing about moving into nonfiction as a fiction writer, which I am and think of myself as, was the ways in which I came to fiction because I've really felt as a child that I was on the outside of the things that happened to me and around me. And I was kind of an odd child, truthfully. And that's not like in a you know, oh, poor me way. I just kind of was a little bit odd. And so I spent a lot of my life observing the things that happened to me. And I would narrate to myself in the third person what was going on around me as a way of trying to find my place in it. And so, you know, it would be, you know, Amy is going to school or Amy is sitting down for lunch. And I would realize much later in my life that this inclination to narratize the events of my life or the events that were going on around me was because I was searching for a way to insert myself into the story. And because I couldn't find, it seems so natural for other people to insert themselves into their lives. And that remains truthfully quite baffling to me. I'm not really sure how some people are so effortless with that, who seem to just roll into the narratives of their lives as if they understand how to be there. I really don't have that, truthfully. I really observe carefully what is happening around me so that I know how to be present and how to move through what is going on. And I use narrative to do that, which I think is why I came to fiction so easily, because it made so much sense to me that you would observe carefully. And I think fiction writers do observe very carefully what's going on around them, and that you would place yourself through characterization into the story. And I felt that when I started doing this work, because there is so much noticing and seeing that grief tries in some ways to take from you, but also in some ways gives to you, because you're so aware. And the amount of the granularity of seeing that I needed to do to feel Curtis on the page, to feel my own pain on the page, came directly for me out of the fiction instinct to observe and to see and to capture everything. I have, born of story writing, an almost creepy kind of observation, really odd in some ways. Like, I recall details about people, and I try very hard in my real life not to creep people out with this knowledge, where I will pretend not to know things about people that I have observed, because I think, well, that's weird that you know what they wore last Tuesday, you know, but I do know it. And that was something that was in the book, that the texture of seeing that to me comes directly from story making and story seeing is the level of specificity in this book. And I'm really grateful for it.
So this will be the last question, and we'll be wrapping up with it. This question is from Celeste. And Celeste says, a little comment first. I loved your electric lit interview.
Oh.
And in it you say Curtis named you as a writer before you claimed this for yourself. Could you speak about what you imagine Curtis might think of your book?
So thank you. I'm so grateful that people are reading the electric lit interview, which I did with my friend Jared, who is a stunning writer. And he just did a really, really heart-opening interview with me. It's beautiful. Curtis loved when I would talk about him. And he was very open about this in our relationship. Throughout it, consistently, when I would go out or if I would be at residencies for long periods of time, I would come home and he would immediately sit on the couch and he would say, okay, start from the beginning. And it was not like, what happened? What did you see? What did you do? It was, what did you tell people about me? And he wanted to know all of it. He was like, don't skip a detail. Like, he was like, what did you tell them how long my hair is? Did you tell them, you know, what kind of food I like? And I would do it because he loved it, but also because it was true. And I would tell him everything that I told people about him. And so I have the really beautiful knowledge of knowing that Curtis would not only love that he is the lodestar of this book, that he is the whole point of the book, that meeting him on the page is the only reason for the book. And the only reason that I felt it had to exist was that people had to know this man who loved living so much, but who had so little time to do it. But I also know if he were to walk through the door, he would sit down with the book and say, okay, but tell me what's in it. That's me. And that's something that I am not able to do with him, but I am so grateful to do with all of you. It's my honor.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you.